Well, welcome to the first module of Forensically Speaking, a course that's brought to you by the International Association of Trauma Professionals. And my name is Harry Morgan. And in this particular module, we're going to be laying the foundation. And so as we do that, you're going to see the larger picture of, well, how do we get started? How does a forensic mental health assessment actually where do we go? How did it even initiate? Who initiated it? And so let's see where that goes. Here's what we're going to have as the objectives of this particular module. We're going to identify what are the various types of a mental health assessment. And there are at least two types. Secondly, we're going to define what a forensic mental health assessment is. We're going to look at the clinician's role in a forensic mental health assessment, and then define our function. The role and function is a little bit different. We're going to understand then the creation. How do you package it? How do you put it together? And understand the context. In other words, who is it going to and how are we writing it? And then finally, we're going to look at the phases, and we'll spend some time in doing that. Okay, let's get started. The various types. There is fundamentally two types of assessments that are done by clinicians. The first are called clinical assessments, and the second are called forensic assessments. Clinical assessments, we're going to see, are done primarily for management of clinical issues. And there is no forensic question. It is not a question of law, criminality, right, wrong. There is no punitive measure. It is therapeutic, clearly. And the forensic, on the other hand, is designed to answer a forensic question. And there is a forensic evidence that we are looking for that has a psycho-legal question involved. There is no extraneous information, whereas with clinical, we may be looking for those other pieces to understand more thoroughly how do we help the client. But with a forensic case, we're focusing primarily on the forensic question. There can be a hybrid where it's both. Now, Carson and Nadkarni, the definition that they give is forensic reports are incidences of communicative behavior written about specific people for audiences, the court, or it could be probation office. It could be an agency that, let's say, is managing children and the welfare of children, audiences with specific needs. Groth and Marnett, their definition is that a clinical assessment is an accurate and effective psychological report that requires clinicians clarify their thinking, crystallize their interpretations. The report serves to tie together all the sources of information, often complex, enter into professional and interpersonal issues are combined. All of the advantages and limitations involved with clinical judgment either directly or indirectly affect the report. The focus should be a clear communication of the clinician's interpretations, conclusions, and recommendations. That's the clinical assessment. We're looking at the composite, the whole picture of the client. Now, for an expert, it's explanations, not opinions. They're not looking for a conclusion that is based on your clinical judgment, where they're looking for in the court or in a forensic setting, what are the proofs for the judgment, conclusion, recommendations that you give. So explanations, not opinions, are the reason that one is an expert. All right, so now what we're going to do is try to, tease this out and see the difference between the role of the clinician in a therapeutic setting and in a forensic setting. The first question is, who's the client? Well, we're typically, as clinicians, working with clients or patients. And by the way, I make the distinction. A patient is one that you have a relationship with. If you're doing this in a forensic setting, they're always clients. There is really no therapeutic alliance between me and the clinician, the client. Therefore, that's why we think of the defendant in many cases as a client. So who is the client in a forensic setting? I put here the attorney. It could be the judge. It could be the agency that is asking for this evaluation. Now, the privilege in terms of disclosure with a therapeutic relationship, the therapist has a confidentiality between the therapist and the patient. However, when you're working in a forensic setting, it is between the professional, the clinician, and the attorney. It is always wise then to have the payment coming from the attorney. It will show up later on in court, a lack of bias. It also ensures that you will get paid. It also defines more the responsibility that you have to the attorney. He defines it or she defines it better for you. And then also, if the product is paid for by the defendant or the client, then there could be a dispute about why they didn't receive the report if they paid for it. If the attorney is paying for it, then that information is given to the attorney and there's a greater control. So the forensic role is very clearly defined that way. And under the cognitive and evaluative attitude that the clinician has with the client or the defendant, it in a therapeutic role, supportive, accepting, empathetic, it is more of a healing role. Whereas in a forensic setting, it is to be objective, it is to be neutral, it is to be detached. There is not to be any alliance. And therefore, when going to court, there is not a prejudice either for or against the client. You're there as a clinician in a forensic setting, as an expert, that is, to be an advocate for the truth, not an advocate for the client. Under the area of competency, for a therapeutic environment, obviously your competency is in your therapy techniques, your understanding of that particular issue that you're addressing as a clinician, and your expertise in that area. But it's in the area of therapy. When we're looking in a forensic role, it is about your ability to evaluate the problem of the referral question using the tools that you have, the techniques that you have, the skills that you have, but it's for aiding the decider of facts in making a judgment. In the nature of the hypothesis and testing, there it's in a therapeutic role, it's for diagnosis and ultimately for therapy. But in a forensic setting, the hypothesis testing is in order to meet the psycholegal criteria. In other words, again, it is for taking your skills as a therapist, as a clinician, as a psychologist, and then moving that into the arena of the forum of the forensic setting in helping the trier of facts make a determination. It's for a judgment rather than in a therapeutic role for therapy and healing. That leads us then to the scrutiny applied to the historical data. How are you looking at that historical data? With the therapeutic role, it's obtained and there's no scrutiny whatsoever. You're looking for the pieces that are going to help that client. If it's not going to help the client, then you're not interested in it. We don't need to go down that rabbit trail. In the forensic setting, it is very much of a concern for collateral sources and being very, very persnickety about whatever facts you can find. However, it is important that if the facts aren't germane to the forensic question, to the referral question, then those facts are not going to be included. While in a therapeutic setting, those facts may be very interesting to you and may be helpful. I can think of a case recently that I had where the individual was an illegal and he was in our country, and he had gotten involved in a sexual crime. And therefore, I was asked to do an evaluation. And in the evaluation, I excluded the fact that that he was illegally in the country because that would prejudice the information. And so while we are very careful in a forensic setting to be scrutinizing lots of information, that doesn't mean it's going to get included simply because we found it. The amount and control of the structure in relationship, in the therapeutic role, the client is one who really structures the sessions. And so if the client comes in and says, I'm really, really depressed, then you're going to discover what is the cause, the etiology of that depression. And therefore, as a clinician, it's very much centered around the client. However, in a forensic setting, the evaluator is the one that really structures it, and there is a lot of control. It is dictated by how much information you need and where you go to get that information, and doing whatever you need in your tools and resources to get it. The nature and degree of adversarialness, obviously in a therapeutic setting, it's very rarely adversarial unless the specter of raising that conflict has a therapeutic purpose. While in a forensic setting, it's frequently adversarial. They're there because they are facing some kind of accusation or charge, and thereby they're not wanting to divulge information is going to incriminate them, and you're going to need to know whatever the truth is that's going to help the decider of facts in making a good judgment. The role, or the goal of the professional in the therapeutic role is to benefit the client. That's always the goal, is the healing of the patient or client that is seeing you. Where in the forensic setting, it's for the benefit of the court. The impact of the critical judgment on relationship, how does that going to affect the relationship that you have with the client? Well, the therapeutic role likely to impair the alliance if you go to court and you have to testify against your client. Whereas in a forensic setting, it's unlikely to cause any emotional harm because, frankly, there was no relationship or very little relationship you had with the client to begin with. You were wanting the facts. You were a detective that was surfacing out whatever the information is that you needed to help the trier of facts. It was not about a friendship or a loyalty or an alliance that you had with the client. Okay, now what is the significance of a forensic mental health assessment? Well, the reports are the primary product of the forensic evaluations. In other words, when you get all done, your work is going to be evidenced in that it could be 15 pages, it could be longer, it might be only 8 or 10 pages. Seldom is it going to be less than a few pages, and most of the time you're not going to be writing more than 30 pages, because the more you write, the less it's read. Oftentimes only the last 2 pages are read by many people anyhow. So your report, how you write it, that's going to be most important. Second, the reports allow the clinician to present themselves as serious experts. People will know then by what you've written, what you're thinking, how you arrived at your thinking, how you as an expert, as a clinician, view the problem, and what information, what evidence you can submit to the trier of facts that will enable them to make the decision that they need. So it really shows your qualifications much more than even your CV. The reports also reveal the clinician's reasoning and their evidence for it, so that they can actually see how you have analyzed the data, how you summarize the data, and how you present the data, so that you can come to a conclusion and later to a recommendation. The reports also can help you to avoid testimony. I was in court earlier this week, sat through 2 hours of hearing various ones. The attorney 3 times brought up the fact that I was in the courtroom, and the judge, because it was a safety plan, said that that's not necessary for Dr. Morgan to give testimony, because the report itself, he felt, did the job. You really have done a great job if you can avoid being on the stand because of the report that you've given. That really helps you. It helps the court. So that's the final purpose that we find with the forensic mental health assessment. Helburn, I've referred to him quite a bit, but forensic assessments focus on helping a legal decision maker decide whether an examinee has certain capacities, abilities, or behavioral tendencies that must be understood in order to decide how to resolve the legal question, which is in some way framed in that referral question. Again, quoting from him, that the forensic mental health assessment is a domain of assessments of individuals intended to assist legal decision makers in decisions about the application of laws requiring consideration of individuals' mental health conditions, abilities, and behaviors. And then finally, the mental health assessment is an assessment of various mental states, psychological phenomena, and behavioral predispositions that are relevant for legal questions about human behavior, but are not symptoms of mental illness. And that's really the difference you can see there between a clinical assessment and a forensic assessment. We're about answering legal questions, not about how to fix or resolve those mental problems. Now, what a forensic mental health assessment cannot do: 2 things. Number one, and oftentimes I will even include this in my report, it does not determine guilt or innocence regarding the specific crime that has been alleged. Sometimes an attorney will ask, do you think so-and-so is guilty? Don't fall for that one. That's not your job. That's not my job to determine guilt and innocence. That's for the trier of facts. Instead, I can give evidence that will support one or the other, but they have to determine whether or not the final rendering is guilt or innocence. And then secondly, the purpose of a forensic mental health assessment is not to give the full, complete composite picture of the individual. Instead, it's a snapshot that's helping to narrow in all the information that you can find about that individual that helps to answer the specific forensic, the referral question that has been submitted to you. Now, what a forensic mental health assessment can do, well, it answers forensic referral questions. And that's really, I keep coming back to that, but that's what it is. It's all about that. The more we focus on that, the more effective you will be as a clinician in a forensic setting. Identify problem areas and complications to the offending problem. Identify treatment needs. So that would be part of your recommendation. Identify supervision needs. What are the problems perhaps that keep and impede effective treatment? So you're going to be identifying those too. And then finally, you're actually laying out a type of therapy plan or a groundwork at least for treatment that addresses the problem. Perhaps incarceration is not the answer. But you're giving an alternative to the trier of facts. Here is what this individual needs, and that is a better way to address the problem. Now, the whole purpose of the forensic mental health assessment is making the implicit explicit, the covert overt. The well-structured, psychologically relevant assessment methodologies can reduce the operation of the judgment biases. In other words, we're helping the trier of facts, and particularly in sex offense cases, there is oftentimes an immediate bias just hearing the word sex offender. There's a bias that is in a jury's mind or in sometimes even a judge's mind. And so the purpose of the assessment is helping them to make an objective, fact-based judgment on the evidence that you have submitted to ensure consistency in information processing and decision making. So that by doing this, there is a methodology and you have proceeded through that methodology, much like a detective that's at a crime scene. And there's a certain way in which information is handled, evidence is handled, and it's processed. It's presented to the district attorney or to the defense attorney, and so all of that is there's a consistency. Safeguard against potential standard of care challenges. It helps then in the process of if there is a therapy plan that is submitted or recommendations where there would be possible issues, and that's going to be identified within the forensic mental health assessment to enhance impartiality and comprehensiveness. Again, objectivity. There isn't a therapeutic relationship between the expert witness, the one who has done the assessment, and the client. Instead, they are just simply coming in as a client and you're evaluating them, but you're as comprehensive as you can be in answering the question that has been presented to you. And that then brings us to then the process, and that is the referral questions given to you. The end result is a forensic evaluation. Now, why are you evaluating the client? Well, the first thing you're going to ask is, who referred the client? Was it an attorney? In this case, it is. And the attorney is submitting to the clinician, here is the referral question. So that is what is important, is who's referring the client. It may be someone else. Will look at some of the situations in which a referral question can be submitted, not always from an attorney, but you need to know that. Why was the person referred? Is there a criminal issue involved? Is there a question of child custody? Is there a question of competency, even of a will? What is the issue that is being presented to you? Who's the person? What are the expectations? It's always good when an attorney or anyone asks you, what are they looking for? What are they expecting? Are they expecting that this person's going to be exonerated? Or are they expecting a downward departure? What are they looking for? And then what are recommendations that are sought? What are they looking for from from you, the clinician. So they're the kinds of questions that you're going to be teasing out as you're going from the referral question to formulating the forensic evaluation. And that then brings us to the referral question. We need to clarify the referral question. Sometimes you need to help the attorney to clarify that question. They may say something nebulous like, well, I just need to know if the client has any mental health issues. Well, you need to help them to be more specific. Why do you need to know that? How does that play into the accusation or the charge that's been brought to him? What are you looking for specifically? Determine who will read the final report. That's important because you're going to write for your audience. You're not just writing to another clinician, so the language is going to be tailored to the reader. It's much like pitching a ball. You're pitching to the catcher. So you want to make sure that the catcher is going to identify and be able to receive the ball. Identify possible abuses of the assessment. How could the assessment be used in a negative or a destructive way? Select the most appropriate instrument for the variable or problem that is being studied. And so there's lots of different tests that you can give. The question is, what is the most appropriate? What is the one that will give you the best effect? Certainly you can build a house with just a hammer, but sometimes you'll need a screwdriver. Sometimes you'll need a pair of pliers. Sometimes you'll need a shovel. And sometimes you'll need a bulldozer. And so it's important to know what are the tools in your box that you're needing in order to get to that assessment completion. And then what appropriate use of computer assisted interpretations. It's important that you're not just taking the MMPI verbal results and just copying and pasting that in. In fact, I will argue that that needs to be very, very carefully used. I have read a number of reports by clinicians that wholesale take the entire PAI or Milan and just simply dump it into a forensic mental health assessment. There has to be an appropriate use of how you use the printout that you received from the computer test. And then the types of referral. Well, again, this goes back to what your wording is going to be, the verbiage. The psychiatric setting, you may have a psychiatrist that is asking for an evaluation. You had a clinical psychologist that was asking for a school psychologist asking for specifics. What am I looking for from them? And so that's going to be helping them to make the decisions they need to make. A general medical setting. It could be a medical doctor and they're wanting to make a decision with regarding some treatment issues. Maybe a legal context, and certainly that is the forensic mental health assessment. It could be a school setting. It can be a psychological clinic. So all of those are different referral settings. Your language is going to be different. Your direction, the answer to the referral question that you would receive from all of these different settings is going to be different. Your report may be long or short, actually, depending upon the setting that you received the referral. So where do you look for relevant laws and statutes? This is really important because your state statute is the first place you go. Not every state permits, by the way, a licensed mental health counselor, licensed clinical social worker, or marriage and family counselor to do forensic mental health assessments. Every state is different. It's important that you have the statutes in front of you that state what it is. In the state of Florida, you can, as long as you have the training in the testing that you do. So it's really important that you have that documentation in the event that you're on the stand and you're called upon to explain the basis of your testing and what qualifies you as the evaluator to make the evaluation. The penal code, what is the Department of Corrections code that would be in any way related to the statutes that you're answering the question to, especially in a forensic setting. Again, the Code of Criminal Procedure, knowing that. Administrative code, it may have to do if you're in the military. What is the SOP regarding the particular issues that you're looking at there? And then finally, occupational code. Is there anything there? And your business, your clinic, the setting in which it's important to know what the rules are that govern your report. Well, now we're going to try to put this all together, and this is really coming now to the summary. The first phase involves the collecting of data about the client. It begins with a referral question and is followed by a review of the client's previous history and records. And at this point, the clinician is already beginning to develop tentative hypotheses and to clarify questions that can be investigated in more detail. The next step is actual client contact, in which the clinician conducts an interview and administers a variety of psychological tests. The client's behavior during this interview, as well as the content of factual data, they're all brought into your focus, and you're noting that. Out of this data, the clinician begins to make his or her inferences. That brings us to phase two. Phase two focuses on the development of a wide variety of inferences about the client. And these inferences, they serve both a summary and an explanatory function. For example, an examiner may infer that a client is depressed, which may also explain his or her slow performance, distractibility, flattened affect, and withdrawal behavior. The examiner may then wish to evaluate whether this depression is a deeply ingrained trait or more of a reaction to a current situational difficulty. This may be determined by referring to test scores, interview data, or any additional sources of available information. The emphasis of the second phase is on developing multiple inferences, and that should initially be tentative. So you're not really coming to a conclusion, you're just identifying what are possibilities, and they serve the purpose of guiding future investigation to obtain an additional information that is used to confirm, modify, or to even negate later hypothesis. That brings us to phase three. Phase three is concerned about either accepting or rejecting the inferences that were developed in phase two. And there is a constant and active interaction between these phases. Often, in investigating the validity of the inference, a clinician will alter either the meaning of the problem or the emphasis of an inference, or will develop an entirely new hypothesis. It is rare that an inference will be entirely sustained, but rather the validity of the inference can become progressively strengthened. Now, this is achieved by evaluating the degree and constancy of the strength of the data that support a particular inference. Now let's move to phase four. As a result of the inference developed in the previous three phases, the clinician now can move to phase four, from a specific inference to general statements about the client. This involves an elaboration of each inference in order to describe trends or patterns of the client. For example, an inference that a client is depressed may be due to self-verbalizations in which the client continually is negative, criticizing, judging their behavior. And this also may be expanded to give information regarding the ease or the frequency with which a person might enter into a depressed state. The general task of phase 4 is to develop and begin to establish statements relating to the client. Now that brings us to stage 5, 6, and 7. In the 5th phase, it involves a further elaboration of a wide variety of personality traits of the individual. It represents an integration and a correlation of the client's characteristics, and this may include describing and discussing such factors as need for achievement, dynamics involved in depression, level of anxiety, conflicting needs, intellectual potential, problem solving, and all of that. Although phases 4 and 5 are very, very similar, phase 5 provides more comprehensive and integrated description of the client than phase 4. Finally, you have phase 6. And phase 6 places this comprehensive description of the person into a situational context. That brings us now to the final phase, phase 7, makes specific predictions regarding the client's behavior. Phase 7 is the most critical. It is involved in decision making and requires that the clinician take into account the interaction between the personal and the situational variables. So that gives you 7 phases in which you go from the initial question, gathering information, all the way to the end in which you have drawn conclusions and then have a predictability of behavior. So that is where we go there. Now, your discussion that you are to post online, describe the various ways a clinical evaluation and forensic assessment are similar and how they are dissimilar. Describe the various ways a clinical evaluation and forensic assessment are similar and dissimilar. Well, that's the end of this module, laying the foundation. The next module, we'll be looking at the forensic mental health builder or evaluator, as we think of this as building a project, building a home. You would be also building an assessment. We're going to now look at you, the assessor. So I'll see you in our next module.